Welcome to Cinemaholics. I'm John Negroni, your usual host from the main show, and with me is my usual co-host, Will Ashton. Hello, Will.
Hi there.
Well, Will, we have to be slightly quieter because we are talking about a movie where if you make even the most ambiguous sound hunting sonic creatures will come murder us.
Okay, yeah, so I'll be extra quiet.
I figured you already knew that because
Sure.
This is part 2. That's right, we're talking about A Quiet Place Part 2, a movie that was supposed to come out last March and is now coming out this week in theaters, only in theaters, from Paramount. Will Ashton, we're going to talk about this movie. We're going to discuss, yes, this is John Krasinski's sequel to the first one. We should start, though, with some setting. This is a direct sequel. A Quiet Place, you and I talked about this film, I believe, with Maverick Hines back in 2018.
Yeah, there was a guest, too. I forget who it was, but there were 4 people on that podcast, I remember.
That's right. And I remember really liking this movie. I remember having a great time at the movie theater. For me, it made a lot of sense that they kind of waited for part 2 to come to theaters instead of putting it out on video on demand or premium video on demand. To be clear, they had the world premiere of this movie on March 8th, 2020, and then the pandemic really just happened like that same week. And I remember John Krasinski even put out a tweet and was like, you know what, this is a movie that should be in theaters, so we're going to delay it. And they delayed it like a whole year. So here it is. It's finally out in release, and it's following up a pretty big box office success, which was the first movie from 3 years ago now. And I think we both liked that movie quite a bit, right?
Yeah, I liked it a good bit. I rewatched it prior to this one, and it's a little bit easier to poke holes when you've seen it the first time, but especially seeing it in theaters, I think it really just became a memorable and worthwhile experience. It's also, just super tight. Like, I think it's like exactly 90 minutes long, and it moves like a bullet train. Like, it's a really well-paced film. I remember that as well, and yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah, remember the logical inconsistencies, a lot of those plot contrivances, they're definitely more apparent thinking about both of these films afterward.
Sure.
But that's the thing, is like when you're in the theater and you're watching them, hopefully you're not thinking about those things as much.
Yeah.
And that's certainly been my experience both times. We both saw this in a theater, which is great to see. We're both vaccinated. We're both feeling pretty safe and healthy in this kind of new world we're kind of carving out this summer. But let's talk about part 2 of this movie. It picks up right after part 1. And to be clear, this is a horror survival movie.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, it also is kind of fitting that they chose to release the movie now, because there is kind of like a meta-narrative of the characters are kind of going out into a world that they are familiar with but don't really understand, and people who are going to the movies are kind of in a similar position right now, oddly enough. So that kind of unintentionally became a parallel. Would you agree?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I was going to get to that.
Sure, okay. Sorry,
We're talking about like the setup.
The gun, yeah.
Jump at the gun, but that's the thing. You're trying to make this conversation as tight as the movie, because like the first movie, it is only about an hour and a half. This one is 97 minutes, and some of that extra time comes in the form of an intro prologue that happens in the very beginning of the film. And a lot of people have said multiple things about this scene. It's like a prologue in the sense that it's taking you through almost in real time the first 10-15 minutes of this creature invasion. I think they're supposed to be aliens. It's never made incredibly clear.
Yeah, because they show that spaceship crawling. I don't know if that's supposed to be just a general plane or their spaceship, but yeah, I always assume they're aliens.
I assume they were aliens as well. And we won't get into detail of like what that intro prologue sort of is telling us, but the gist of it is that we see this family kind of in the real world, like kind of in the before times, and it's kind of an excuse for us to hang out with John Krasinski again, his character in this movie. Now, of course, we're going to have to spoil things that happened in A Quiet Place Part 1, so there is that warning. But yes, in A Quiet Place, the first movie, we of course see John Krasinski pass away. His character, of course, dies in that movie. He's the father figure who's kind of keeping everything together. And that movie ends with the family kind of being on their own, ostensibly. And part 2 opens up with him back in the cast. And we are also introduced to another character who is played by Cillian Murphy, who we might see later in the sequel. What did you think of the intro prologue before we get into the actual movie? They feel like such separate things. I kind of want to get your read on that part of it first.
Yeah, I thought it was going to kind of bug me for that reason, because it kind of felt like it was going to be a bit of a prologue, like almost an excuse to put John Krasinski back in front of the camera. But I feel like the opening was probably my favorite scene in the film. Granted, it takes a lot from War of the Worlds, Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds, and just in terms of like how it builds up suspense and just the kind of like general like ground level sense of not knowing what's happening, and just general sense of like chaos in the streets and stuff like that. But I thought it was pretty well done and pretty appropriately tense, so I was a fan of that sequence.
There is a scene involving like a bus, for example, that's like coming
Sure.
down the street. I mean, it's just great.
Oh yeah, that was
filmmaking.
also trying to rip off a little bit of a Quran, I guess, because they were doing like the Children of Men thing there with like the spinning camera in the car and stuff. But
A little bit, yeah. It's kind of easy, kind of easy to go there. I definitely think that War of the Worlds is a good comparison point for this movie, and I think that as I was watching this intro, I was having that thought of like, what is this really supposed to be adding? And I was hoping that it wasn't going to go into a problem that I actually think the movie doesn't trip up in, but we might get into that later, which is the typical, like the sequelitis, however you say that, where it feels like everything has to be explained. I mean, we have to have like an origin, or we have to have like a reason for these creatures. The first movie leaves all of that out. First movie is just sort of like, they're here. They can do this thing where they can hear from hundreds of miles away, and you have to be completely silent all the time in order to survive.
right, and that's why I thought it was going to bug me, but I thought the movie was pretty effective about not revealing too much in the opening. Just generally just like, hey, here's why this family was able to survive during this. They kind of have like their own system, like they're not perfect, but they do kind of it makes sense, like watching those sequences, why they were able to survive as long as they did in this post-apocalyptic world and stuff. But yeah, I mean, there wasn't like a new sequence where we were trying to figure out. I guess there was kind of, but it wasn't. It didn't feel as over-explaining as you were suggesting.
Like in the first movie, this is directed and written by John Krasinski himself. The characters and I think part of like this world are sort of developed by Brian Woods and Scott Beck. And as I mentioned before, this picks up right after part one. In the first movie, we sort of end it with the Abbott family, with Emily Blunt returning as the mother character, Evelyn, and the two children. They're both kind of like in their teen years, sort of. Noah Jupe is the younger one, and then Millicent Simmonds is the eldest child.
Yeah.
And she is deaf, and she figures out, with the aid of her family, that her hearing aids on the right frequency and used with an amplifier can actually create an opening to take out these creatures. So that's how the first movie ends, is with them being able to exploit this weakness. And it's considered a huge breakthrough because up until this point, seemingly no one has figured out a way to reliably take out these creatures. They're too fast. They're too bulletproof. They're pretty resistant to fire and other types of things. So the fact that they were able to find any sort of way to handle these creatures long enough to survive is treated as a big reveal. And so this movie opens in kind of an interesting way, where it's the morning after those terrible events. Their father, played by John Krasinski, is now gone, and they're leaving their sort of desolate farm, which has been torn to shreds, to find refuge somewhere else. There are a few moments in the first film that allude to when they light the fires atop the grain mill. They see that there are other camps or other human beings who are finding ways to survive. And so that's how this movie begins. They set out, especially now that Emily Blunt's character, Evelyn, has a baby, and they need help. They need resources. They need a place to take refuge. And so they go in search of that. And from there, the movie is a bit more sprawling this time around. It's a bigger setting. We see the characters kind of separate actually here and there. But I think very similar to the first film, it's a very tight sequel. It's a very action-packed movie that relies a lot on a technique that Krasinski really likes, which is intercutting two very distinct set pieces and finding interesting ways to edit them with each other so that the tension just feels doubled, even though you're following two very different sequences. And it reminds me a lot of the type of filmmaking we see from Christopher Nolan. I'm sure that Krasinski is taking a lot of inspiration from him there. And yeah, I think this movie delivers in very much the same way as part one. But what do you think, Will?
Ultimately, I do think it's a solid sequel. I think in some ways it's better than the first movie, and a few other ways it's worse. Primarily, as you were suggesting, I think there is the danger of, like, when we explore more into the world, are we kind of taking away from what made the original film interesting, or a little bit tighter as terms of its being like an allegory or metaphor for parenthood. I do appreciate that this film, it is adding to that. It's exploring the idea of, like, I don't know if it's a spoiler to say this at all, but just the idea of, like, the first movie is just the general dangers of parenting and, like, parents kind of learning to, like, walk into a world where, like, seemingly everything can be a huge danger or risk. In this film, it's more about, like, acceptance that kids kind of have to find their own path. You're suggesting now that they're, like, becoming teenagers, just kind of learning to entrust that they have some independence, or that they can handle their own kind of perils in the world while also, you know, being there when you need to. And I don't think the metaphor is quite as neat and tidy as it was in the first film, but I do appreciate, like you said, that John Krasinski is allowing himself to be a little bit more nuanced, like expand the world, but he's not overdoing it. Like he is still keeping it pretty contained to, like, a few different set pieces and a few central characters. Like, it does feel like a pretty competent film from a directorial standpoint. However, I do feel like his screenwriting is still his weakest of, like, as terms of him being like an actor, writer, director. I still think screenwriting is probably the weakest job for him. Not that he's necessarily bad at it. I think he is pretty good about being restrained in terms of his narrative and recognizing his strengths and what he wants to tell with these stories. But at the same time, I do feel like the characters themselves aren't as fleshed out, at least some of them, because I do think Millicent, or what's her name? Is it Millicent Simmonds?
That's right, Millicent Simmonds.
Yeah, I think she's really given a lot of great showcases here, and I do think Noah Jupe is given a little bit more to do, and I appreciate that. But I still feel like Emily Blunt is still often short-sighted here. Like, I was hoping this movie would finally give us a little bit more with her, especially now that she's, like, kind of the lead, and I still feel like I don't really have a good read on her character outside of the circumstances of the film. Like, it just feels like she's kind of just there to service the narrative in both films, and that's disappointing because I do think she clearly is, you know, emotionally invested in these films. I think she does give a generally pretty good performance, but it just feels like Krasinski isn't really giving her as much to do, which is so strange because, you know, it's his wife or his partner in real life. So I always find that to be a bit odd, but yeah, I think generally this is a decent follow-up. I do think Krasinski is improving in some ways as a filmmaker, and I do think generally what works in the first film is seen in this film. I do kind of feel like the novelty isn't quite there as much as it was in the first film, so it may not be quite as tense. At least for me, like, I didn't find myself quite as I didn't feel myself as tense. I wasn't feeling as intense as it was the first time, but at the same time, I do appreciate that the movie itself is trying to, like, kind of have more moments for character development, have more, like, talk-driven scenes. So it's not like the first film where it's, like, constantly, like, kind of building up the suspense as it's going along. But yeah, I think there's a solid sequel here. I don't think it's quite as good as the first one, but overall, it's not a bad effort.
I think this movie, because it knows that it's kind of reaching its audience in a different environment here. I think that it's making a lot of these choices that are pretty intentional. I think sidelining Emily Blunt's character, it is unfortunate. I think, like, she has her moments in this movie, to be totally clear. Like, she gets to do pretty interesting. She has her own action set pieces. It's not like she's not in the movie.
Yeah, I'm not saying that.
In terms of the movie's, like, thematic weight, I think it does kind of push her to the side a little bit as being a little bit less crucial to the plot. And I think it's all very much because Krasinski wants part two to be, as you were alluding to be about the kids and about the kids kind of stepping up and being able to take care of themselves in this intense world. And I think that, yeah, you're right that, yeah, the gimmick is worn off, and I think that was going to happen no matter what. Like, it just, the novelty's worn off. It can't be as tense. But what I do like is that to make up for it, the Krasinski, I think he found a way to make this a little bit more relentless. That first movie has a lot of quiet moments. There's not a ton of dialogue in that movie. There's certainly a lot of interaction. There's a lot of communication, but there aren't a lot of moments where like characters are really sitting down and having, like, really deep heart to hearts. And in this one, there's a little bit more of that, I thought. And I think that those heart-to-hearts are probably probably put together in a more organized fashion, because I think that breaking this family apart for a lot of this film is really helpful, because it helps the metaphor of specifically Millicent Simmonds' character kind of going out into the world and having to sort of see what she's made of, right? And that it's not going to go perfectly. They're not treating her like a superhero character or anything like that, which I appreciated. They're actually like making sure to set out this world is extremely dangerous, and you do need other people. You do need friends and allies. And I think that this movie avoided a big issue that I was dreading. As I was watching this. So Cillian Murphy gets introduced partway through this movie. We sort of see his character in the intro prologue. And when he first comes on, I'm just like, oh, shoot, are they really just putting him in this movie because the dad died in the first movie, and so they have to have this sort of like surrogate father kind of thing? And it's like, you can't have the family function without this kind of person. And that was starting to be like, oh, I hope that's not where this movie goes. And fortunately, I don't think it does. I think it relies more on using him as a surrogate for humanity, trying to find some redemption in this world, trying to find some hope in the hopelessness. And I think that this movie, where it trips up a lot, is in some of the character arcs. I think like Noah Jupe's character arc is like all payoff, no setup, personally. I think that the cracks in the screenplay definitely show up with Krasinski when it comes to the Noah Jupe character, and like some of his character decisions, some of like what he does in the movie. I was very much like, this really isn't as strong as his sister's story, which I think was a lot stronger, which was a lot more interesting to follow. And I also thought that he put a lot of care and attention into Cillian Murphy's character and what he goes through in this movie. And so all that stuff really worked for me. But, kind of similar to you, it's definitely not a movie that is going to, I think, probably hold up perfectly. Every time that you rewatch it, I'm sure it's going to be one of those movies we rewatch and be like, yeah, that was a strange decision there. But I do appreciate where they made good decisions in this movie, like keeping this world contained, not doing the typical sequel thing where the monsters have to be bigger and badder, like the Jurassic World problem, Jurassic Park problem, where, well, we can't just have a T-Rex this time. Now it has to be a bigger T-Rex. Instead, it's the same dangers, but like there are more layers added to the world that make sense and feel a little inevitable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it does do a couple sequelitis things that bug me. For instance, the movie itself, it takes place more in the daytime, so we see the monsters more often, which I think it was sort of inevitable because we saw the monsters fairly often towards the end of the first movie. But I feel like it's less scary knowing what they look like now. I just felt the tension wasn't quite as there. For that reason, a few others, I just don't think, as you're mentioning, because the story is a little bit more layered this time, it's a little bit harder for Krasinski to sustain the tension as he did in the first movie. And likewise, the fact that it does allow itself to have it is a little bit more of like a family drama this time, as opposed to being a more straightforward horror movie in the first movie, as it was like in the first movie. But generally, yeah, I do agree with you. I think the strengths here are pretty apparent. I do think that Krasinski remains a pretty competent filmmaker, and I think he recognizes what people appreciate about the first film. I also think he takes a few notes and he recognizes that like some of the leaden exposition that he had in the first movie is a little less seen here. For instance, those like headlines where it was like, it's sound, and then like that like giant whiteboard that everyone made fun of, where it's just like, what is the weakness and stuff like that. He's a little bit better about not doing stuff like that this time around, which I appreciate. And I think that shows, yeah, I think, and that, that shows like he's growing as a filmmaker, and I think he recognizes what was working and what doesn't. But yeah, not a flawless sequel, but I think ultimately, generally it works more than it doesn't. And I do really appreciate, especially when I was rewatching the first film, I didn't really realize until then how much like sign language really, like how much that movie does rely on ALS and how it feels
ASL.
ASL, I apologize. And it does feel like pretty seamless in how it is able to do that in a major motion picture in a way that I feel is pretty progressive. Now, I've heard like some kind of criticisms about like how the movie portrays being death, which it's not really like my place to say, but I do think that how the film is able to show the being disabled or having a disability is pretty smart, and I do appreciate that aspect about the film as well.
Yeah, I mean, our listeners know I'm deaf. And so watching this movie, I don't know how other people feel about it. You're entitled to feel the way you feel. But for me, watching somebody use their hearing aids to take out alien monsters and using their disability as an advantage, that to me always rings pretty true. You know, that to me feels like they're putting like actual care, and they're listening to Millicent Simmonds herself, who's deaf in real life, in terms of like making this character feel like a real person. Because it's tough, you know, it really is tough to portray these things on screen in a way that is inclusive without being, you know, exploitative, right? What I appreciate about her character is that she's not invincible. She makes mistakes. She has her own sort of journey. She has an impact on the world, not despite her disability, but because of it, and aligned with the rest of her entire being. And I personally, I think that they actually handle it pretty well. I'm sure other people have different takes, and they're certainly entitled to that for sure. But yeah, it certainly did not bother me whatsoever. In fact, I think that this is one of the few movies, one of the only like franchise movies really happening that even has this sort of element to it and does it as well as it does. So yeah, I certainly am a fan myself. And there's a big departure for me because when I watched the first Quiet Place, my hearing hadn't fully gone yet, you know? So like I wasn't using hearing aids yet, but I remember watching that movie and being like, you know, knowing that this was going to be my future, that I was going to be needing hearing aids pretty soon. I've obviously got them, and now I have them. So like watching this in a theater 3 years later, hearing aids in tow, and being able to hear a lot of the conversations in this movie a lot better than I otherwise would have. It was a cool experience for me personally.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, yeah, so we have this and Coda coming out too. So it's going to be a good year for disability or the deaf community representation in film. So
Sound of Metal kind of kicked it off, you know, it's like a wave, a sound wave.
Sure.
But yeah, I got to say, it's very easy to pick this movie apart. I think for me, one thing I haven't mentioned yet, I do think this movie's third act is like bordering on incomplete. You know, I think that it kind of ends on a whimper. Like, I'm glad that it's as tight as it is and it's not too long, but I did find myself feeling a little underwhelmed. There is a certain, I don't even think it's a twist. There's a plot development involving where these characters need to go that I thought was very strange. It raised a lot of questions, a lot of like, why didn't anyone think of this before? Like, I would have assumed that you could lampshade that with a quick thing of dialogue, but no, I mean, it ends up being the most obvious thing. And yeah, I think that speaks a little bit to your earlier criticism of Krasinski's screenplay. I just think it's missing some world building flair that would have made this world feel like it has a little bit more flavor. I think that's the thing. One of the biggest limitations is that it's such a crowd pleasing franchise blockbuster that its world can feel a little bit sanitized, a little bit unremarkable. And that can be tough for some people, especially if you're a fan of a lot of other dystopian post-apocalypse stories. I mean, just last year we had The Last of Us Part 2, a video game, but a video game that very much is like a movie. And it's such a distinct difference between these two intellectual properties and the way that that world really feels like its own thing with rules that are very distinct. And when you're in that world, you know you're in that world. If you're in A Quiet Place Part 2, it kind of just feels a little bit like so many other movies and shows that we've seen in the genre. So it is sort of missing that, but I can't complain too much because, Will, it's just so nice to see like something like this that's not based on a comic book or a book or anything. It was just like an original idea, and somebody made some pretty satisfying, crowd-pleasing movies out of them. I love to see it.
Yeah, and this was the first film, if I recall correctly, that you did see in theaters post-vaccination, right?
This was my big return.
Yeah.
And there was nothing quite like it, because this is the longest I'd ever gone between seeing movies in a theater ever, because like I'd have to go back to the first time I ever watched a movie in a movie theater for it to be over a year. Right, I've been watching movies multiple times per year since I was 5 years old. And so, you know, sitting in the seat was one thing, but when the day one sequence starts in this movie and it stretches and fills the entire screen, like you kind of prepped me for it. I did get a little misty eyed. I was like, oh, I can't imagine like ever losing this. Right. If that's one thing that the pandemic has really made clearer to me than it was before, and I think that it was pretty clear, but yeah, there's always room for doubt, right? Is that this experience can't be traded. Like you can't substitute the theatrical experience quite the same. Like it's not something we could just easily get rid of and expect nothing, like no change. Like, oh, watching it at home is the same. It's not. It just isn't.
And that's ultimately why I am glad that they held this movie off for theaters, because I think, however you feel about the film, it does really complement the theatrical experience. And I think people are recognizing that. It made, I think, it's like $60 million on its opening weekend, which, coming towards the tail end of this pandemic is definitely very helpful or hopeful, I guess, in terms of like recognizing that theaters can hopefully be sustaining for years to come. And I do hope that a movie like this is going to lead the charge for people going back to theaters more comfortably in the future. I don't know if it was the same for your showing, but there was like a little intro message that John Krasinski had at the beginning of this film where he was like basically just like, hey, thanks for coming out to see this movie in theaters. And I'm glad
I didn't
you guys
see that.
Okay, yeah, there was a little thing where he was just like, I'm glad you guys recognize that theaters are awesome and stuff, and thanks for coming out. And it was a little nice thing.
As long as it was not like the one for The Incredibles 2, where I was like, just start the movie. And they're like, we know you've been waiting for 14 years.
Oh, yeah,
that
like,
one. Yeah, we got it. We know. Can you start the movie now?
Sure.
It's here. It's finally. Yeah. Okay, yeah, we got it. Can you just...
No, this one was real short and sweet. He was just like, basically just like, yeah, thanks for coming out. Yeah, I mean, I think they did it like real quickly. Like they probably did like a press junket or something, but
he was probably doing some good news, and it was just like right after it. And he was...
I wouldn't be surprised if he did like that. Like he was just like in his room with like his tie and stuff. But...
Here's some really good news. You're here with me.
Yes. But don't take my word for it. Yeah.
You're going to see how great of a dad I am.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of that I did feel as well with this film where it's like he does kind of like make himself like the hero, but that was kind of more from like the last movie, so that didn't bother me as much this time. But I guess it's kind of like his ego kind of going in, but he's directing a movie and starring in and writing it. I guess that's to be expected.
Yeah, I think that is spot on. Yeah, so what you were saying, it made $58.5 million over Memorial Day weekend in the United States and Canada, and it made $22 million more than that internationally. So already an $80.5 million worldwide box office, which is definitely a sign that the movies are back. And that's great news for, I think, a lot of people who want to keep watching movies in movie theaters. I'm certainly one of them, especially after watching this movie. A bunch of other stuff we didn't get into. Djimon Hounsou is in this movie as well. But I think we'd have to get into spoilers to kind of talk about that. Scoot McNairy kind of shows up in this movie, which I was surprised to see.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I think we can agree that it's a solid movie. We of course have our own little quibbles and criticisms. For me, ultimately, I come down on this with a kind of a B. I was kind of between like a low B, solid B. I think like a lot of the other movies I've seen this week, like The Dry, Cruella, I think that, this is another B. It's like all Bs for me this week. And for me, that's a solid recommendation. I think if you like the first one, this is very similar to it. It feels a lot more like a continuation than a sequel trying to really up the ante in artificial ways. And that's the kind of sequel or continuation, that I personally like as a moviegoer. I like that sort of like fleshing out of the world. I'm glad that he didn't take too much from, like, for example, Godfather Part 2. I was really glad that he didn't try to like weave the day one stuff throughout the whole movie. And because, he might be thinking he's Francis Ford Coppola, that would have been probably unfortunate. I think this movie really works for what it's trying to do. And there's only a few compromises you have to deal with, particularly in the third act, which I think certainly has some troublesome screenplay directions, but other than that, I think it's a really, really fine watch for me. So what about you?
Yeah, I'm not too far from you. I was kind of between a B- and a C+ when I was walking out of it, because initially I was feeling a little underwhelmed by it. It didn't have the same impact as the first movie. It didn't have the same strong sense of pacing either, but just thinking back on it, I do generally think it works. It does kind of have, as you're suggesting, that Desolation is Small kind of thing where it feels like a middle chapter more than like a proper sequel, to the point where, I guess kind of mimicking the first movie, it doesn't really have a clear resolution. It just sort of ends. Whereas in the first movie, I found that to be satisfying. This movie, I found that to be a little bit annoying. It just didn't work as well for me at this time in that respect. But generally speaking, I do think it works. I think Krasinski is really coming into his own as a filmmaker. Clearly, as we were suggesting, he takes like cues from other filmmakers to the point where I don't think he really has his own individual stamp. Yeah, it does kind of feel like he's borrowing notes from his peers. But, that's not the worst thing to do for, a sitcom actor becoming a filmmaker. I think he's taking the right lessons more often than not. And I think he's taking a few risks that generally pay off. And by and large, I do think he is definitely at a better place now as a filmmaker than he was when he was making stuff like Brief Interviews with Hideous Men and The Hollers, which I don't believe, John, you've seen, but neither of them are worth your time, I will admit. So I think he is definitely improving as a filmmaker, even though this film isn't quite as good as the last one. So I'll give it an admirable B-.
Yeah, I think the only stamp that Krasinski even seems to be trying to go for is the like family dynamic in a survivalist environment. Like he's trying that sort of aesthetic, but so yeah, what you're saying, it's not a very unique directing flair. It's not something that I think is very, like, if you're watching this movie, you're like, of course it's John Krasinski. Like, that hasn't quite happened yet. But I think on that note, it's time to talk about Emily Blunt in Fantastic Four. No? Okay, that's fine. We won't talk about that.
Is that still a thing? I know people
I
keep
don't know.
trying. I didn't know if that's like an actual thing that's happening, or if that's just like the fans are like they should play Mr.
It's a
and Mrs.
fan thing.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. People can't stop, can't help themselves. So yeah, that is A Quiet Place Part 2. B for me, B- for Will Ashton. It's just 97 minutes long. Critics like it. It's let's see what the Rotten Tomatoes score is. I actually haven't looked at it yet because we did mention the box office is really good, and I think the cinema score is pretty high as well. So I think it's like an A-.
Yeah.
But Rotten Tomatoes wise, it's a 91% out of 222 reviews. Average rating of 7.5 out of 10. I mean, that's about in line. I think a lot of people are saying it's good. It's like I haven't seen a lot of people who are like, this is amazing, it's going to blow your mind. We're certainly not in that camp. But as a theatrical experience, it certainly is satisfying for all the best ways it's supposed to be, and it's going to be available to stream on Paramount Plus pretty soon. The exclusivity window is not as wide as it used to be, so it's going to be available on that streaming service in about 42 days. It's supposed to be like 45 days after its theatrical debut. So if you can't see it in a theater, or you want to keep playing it safe, which is totally understandable, you should be able to watch it on that service pretty soon. Thank you so much for listening to our show. Be sure to subscribe to Cinemaholics on your favorite podcast app of choice, or find us on YouTube. See you all next time.